Every day the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, China gets stronger, and by the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly why. Right now, oil is trading above $100 a barrel. That single number is quietly bankrupting factories, collapsing currencies, and forcing governments to their knees across Europe, Asia, and the developing world. $100 a barrel means the average American family is spending over $5,000 a year just on fuel and energy costs alone. You heard that right. $5,000 every year. Gone before rent, before food, before anything else. And while every other major economy is bleeding out, one country is not just surviving this crisis, it's feeding on it. The $100 oil trap. You've been told that high oil prices hurt everyone equally, that when energy costs spike, every nation absorbs the same pain, adjusts, and moves on. But that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is something far more calculated and far more dangerous for the West than any politician is willing to admit. Think about what $100 oil actually means at street level. It means the guy filling up his truck in Ohio is paying $80, $90, sometimes over $100 at the pump for a single fill. It means the family in Germany that already pays some of the highest electricity rates in the developed world is now watching their monthly energy bill climb past what some households pay in rent. It means pain real, daily, impossible to ignore pain that seeps into every corner of economic life. And here's the part nobody is saying out loud, that pain is the most powerful EV sales pitch China has ever received. But this was just the beginning of what China understood before anyone else did. For years, Western analysts called China's aggressive push into electric vehicles premature, too early, too expensive. Consumers weren't ready. The infrastructure wasn't there. The range wasn't good enough. Every year, the same experts said the same things, and every year, China kept building. BYD, SAIC, NIO, Xpeng, they weren't just building cars. They were building an escape hatch from oil dependency, and they were building it at a scale the West couldn't match, even if it wanted to. At the start of this decade, China was already manufacturing over 60% of the world's electric vehicles. Today, that number is even higher. Now oil crosses $100 a barrel, and suddenly, that escape hatch looks like the only door in the room. Here's what the numbers show you. Every time oil prices sustain above $80 per barrel for more than 6 months, EV adoption accelerates by double digits in price-sensitive markets. You heard that right, double digits. Not a gentle nudge toward cleaner transportation, a hard economic shove. And when oil sits above $100, that shove becomes a stampede. Consumers in Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Middle East markets that were considered lukewarm on EVs just 3 years ago are now placing orders for Chinese-made electric vehicles at a pace that is breaking records month after month. Then came the most devastating part for Western automakers. These aren't buyers considering a Chinese EV alongside a Ford or a Volkswagen. These are buyers who've already done the math and made the decision. A BYD Seagull costs under $15,000. At $100 oil, the fuel savings alone pay back the difference within 2 years. There is no competition, there is no debate. The math makes the choice. And it's not just passenger cars. Chinese electric buses, electric motorcycles, electric three-wheelers. The entire mobility stack is being repriced by this crisis in China's favor. Cities across Africa and South Asia that were running diesel fleets 3 years ago are now in active procurement conversations with Chinese manufacturers because the alternative feeding those diesel fleets at current oil prices is simply no longer financially survivable. But the real leverage isn't just in the vehicles themselves. Every EV sold means a battery sold. Every battery sold means a solar panel nearby isn't far behind. China controls over 80% of the global solar panel supply chain and over 70% of lithium-ion battery production. You heard that right. 80% of solar panels, 70% of batteries, and now a tidal wave of demand flooding in because oil just became too expensive to ignore. Western governments spent years trying to legislate their populations toward clean energy. Carbon taxes, green subsidies, mandate after mandate, and adoption still crawled. China didn't need any of that. It just needed oil to stay above $100. The market did the rest. Every day the strait stays closed is another day Chinese EV factories run at full capacity filling orders that didn't exist 18 months ago. Every day is another day a developing nation locks itself into a Chinese energy ecosystem it won't leave for a generation. And that's just one mechanism working in China's favor. Because while the world scrambles to afford fuel, China's competitors are facing an even more immediate threat, one that's shutting their factories down entirely. The factory survival test. You know what a factory shutdown actually sounds like? It's not an explosion. It's not a dramatic announcement. It's silence. It's the hum of machinery that was running yesterday going quiet overnight. It's workers showing up to a parking lot that used to be full and finding a notice on the gate. That's what's happening right now across industrial Europe and parts of Asia. And it's happening because the energy costs required to keep those factories running have become mathematically impossible to absorb. Here's the setup you need to understand. Energy-intensive manufacturing steel, aluminum, chemicals, glass, cement, fertilizer requires enormous continuous power consumption. These aren't industries that can simply switch to a cheaper energy source overnight. They're locked into infrastructure built over decades, running on energy contracts that made sense when oil and gas were cheap, and now bleeding cash every single hour the crisis continues. A German steel plant running at full capacity right now is paying energy costs per ton that would have seemed like a typo 2 years ago. Some of them aren't running at full capacity anymore. Some of them aren't running at all. But this was just the beginning of the industrial collapse nobody wanted to say out loud. BASF, one of the largest chemical manufacturers on the planet, began scaling back its European operations, not because demand dried up, but because the energy required to meet that demand cost more than the products were worth. Aluminum smelters across Europe started curtailing output as electricity prices made production economically suicidal. Fertilizer plants, the facilities that feed the supply chains that feed entire nations, started shutting down because natural gas, their primary feedstock, became too expensive to justify continued operation. You heard that right. Factories that exist to produce the inputs for global food supply were going dark because of energy costs. And every one of those factories that goes dark creates a vacuum, a production gap, an order that now needs to be filled by someone else. Then came the most devastating realization for Western industry. China was still running. While European and Asian competitors were throttling back, rationing energy, and sending workers home, Chinese factories were operating at full capacity. And the reason comes down to 2 decisions China made years ago that the West called excessive, paranoid, and economically wasteful. First, the Russian pipeline network. When the West sanctioned Russian energy and severed those supply lines, China quietly expanded them. The power of Siberia pipeline system was already moving Russian natural gas into northeastern China. New agreements accelerated capacity. While Germany was paying spot market prices that hit the equivalent of over $50 per million BTU at peak crisis, China was receiving Russian pipeline gas at a fraction of that cost, under long-term fixed contracts. You heard that right, a fraction. Not a small discount, a fraction. Second, China's strategic petroleum reserve. Western analysts spent years questioning why China was building underground storage caverns capable of holding hundreds of millions of barrels of crude. It seemed like overkill. It seemed like the kind of infrastructure spending that only made sense if you believed a global supply disruption was inevitable. Now, those caverns are the difference between keeping the lights on and joining the queue of nations rationing industrial output. China drew on those reserves the moment the strait tightened, smoothing out the supply shock before it could translate into the kind of energy price spike crippling every other major manufacturer on Earth. And it's not just that China kept running. It's that China kept running while its direct competitors stopped. Every week, a German chemical plant sits idle. Is a week Chinese chemical exporters capture that market share. Every month, a South Korean steel mill runs below capacity. Is a month Chinese steel fills those contracts. Market share lost during a supply crisis doesn't come back the moment the crisis ends. Customers find new suppliers, sign new contracts, build new relationships, and they don't rebuild the old ones just because the old supplier's lights came back on. The factories going quiet in Europe and Asia aren't just losing production. they're losing their customers permanently. And those customers are finding exactly one alternative at scale. But here's where the story shifts from economic to geopolitical, because it's not just factories making this calculation. Entire nations are running the same math. And what they're finding is changing the global order faster than any war ever could. The developing world pivot. You need to put yourself in the position of a finance minister in a developing nation right now. Not a wealthy one. Not one with sovereign wealth funds or decades of foreign currency reserves to burn through. A nation where energy imports already consumed 30, 40, sometimes 50% of the national budget before this crisis started. Now oil is above $100 a barrel. Shipping costs are elevated, and the currency your country trades in has weakened against the dollar because global risk appetite collapsed the moment the strait tightened. You are not managing an inconvenience. You are managing an existential threat to your country's economic survival, and you have maybe two realistic options sitting in front of you. Option 1 is the Western financial system, the IMF, the World Bank, bilateral loans from Washington or Brussels. And if you've dealt with those institutions before, you already know what comes attached to that money. Austerity conditions, privatization requirements, currency adjustments that transfer pain directly onto the poorest citizens in your country. You know the terms before they're even offered, because you've seen what those terms did to your neighbors. But this was just the beginning of why the math kept pointing somewhere else. Option 2 is China. And in the middle of a global energy crisis, China's offer looks nothing like it did 5 years ago. It looks like salvation. Chinese infrastructure financing through the Belt and Road Framework doesn't come with the same conditionality. It comes with pipelines, refineries, solar farms, and grid infrastructure that can actually reduce your dependence on the imported oil that's currently draining your treasury. It comes with payment flexibility, yuan-denominated contracts that sidestep dollar exposure, and the implicit backing of a country that just demonstrated to the entire world that it can absorb a global energy shock without flinching. You heard that right. The most powerful sales pitch China has right now isn't a brochure or a diplomatic speech. It's simply what the world just watched happen. China stayed stable. Everyone else didn't. Then came the acceleration nobody in Washington fully anticipated. Nations across Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Latin America aren't just entertaining Chinese energy deals anymore. They're signing them fast. Because the alternative is watching their foreign currency reserves evaporate, paying for oil they can barely afford, while waiting for Western financing that arrives slow, conditional, and attached to political strings they can't afford to pull. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Kenya, Argentina. The list of nations deepening their Chinese energy and infrastructure ties during this crisis isn't a footnote, it's a tectonic shift. And every deal signed during a crisis carries an emotional weight that deals signed during peacetime never do. These nations will remember who showed up when the lights were going out. And it's not just emergency financing that's changing hands. China is offering something even more valuable to energy-starved developing nations right now: technology transfer on solar and battery infrastructure that can permanently reduce their oil import dependency. A nation that builds out Chinese solar capacity during this crisis doesn't just solve its immediate energy problem. It locks itself into Chinese hardware, Chinese maintenance contracts, Chinese grid management systems, and Chinese financing for the next generation of expansion. The relationship doesn't end when oil prices normalize. It deepens. But here's what makes this particularly devastating for Western influence. For decades, the foreign policy strategy of the United States and Europe in the developing world rested on one assumption: that when things got bad enough, those nations would come to Western institutions for help, and that help would come with alignment, political alignment, strategic alignment, vote with us at the UN alignment. That assumption is being shredded in real time, because when things got bad enough, China was faster, cheaper, and came without the lecture. Every nation that pivots toward Chinese energy infrastructure during this crisis is a nation that becomes structurally harder to pull back into the Western orbit. The dependency isn't just financial. It's physical. It's built into the ground, wired into the grid, embedded in the systems that keep the lights on. And the developing world pivot is only possible because of something China built long before this crisis started: infrastructure that the West called wasteful, preparation that analysts called paranoid, strategic depth that nobody took seriously until now. The paranoid over-engineering payoff. You've probably heard the phrase, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Most governments say it. Almost none of them actually do it. Because real preparation, the kind that actually works when a crisis hits, is expensive, politically unpopular, and impossible to justify to a public that can't see the threat yet. It looks like waste. It looks like paranoia. It looks like a government shoveling money into holes in the ground for no good reason. That's exactly what Western analysts said about China's infrastructure investments for the better part of 2 decades. They were wrong in a way that is now impossible to overstate. Let's walk through what China actually built while the world was watching and dismissing it. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve Caverns. China didn't just build storage tanks. It carved massive underground caverns into bedrock across multiple provinces, capable of holding somewhere between 900 million and 1 billion barrels of crude oil. You heard that right, close to 1 billion barrels, sitting underground, invisible, untouchable by any surface disruption. When the Strait of Hormuz tightened and global oil supply chains convulsed, China opened those reserves and kept its industrial economy running without blinking. The West's strategic reserves, by comparison, were drawn down during previous crises and never fully rebuilt. When this crisis hit, those cushions were thinner than they'd been in decades. But this was just the beginning of what that preparation actually bought: the pipeline network. China didn't wait for Middle Eastern oil to become reliable. It built overland alternatives. The Central Asia-China pipeline system moves natural gas from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan directly into Western China without touching a single ocean shipping lane. The Russia-China Power of Siberia pipelines move gas from Siberian fields into northeastern China under long-term contracts priced well below the screaming spot market rates everyone else is paying right now. While European nations were scrambling to build floating LNG terminals and bidding against each other at panic prices for liquefied natural gas shipments, China was receiving pipeline energy at contracted rates locked in years ago. The infrastructure looked like overkill. When oil was at $60, at $100 it looks like the smartest money ever spent. Then came the moment the shadow fleet stopped being a conspiracy theory. For years, Western intelligence agencies and shipping analysts tracked what they called China's shadow fleet, a collection of tankers operating outside Western regulated insurance and tracking systems, moving oil from sanctioned suppliers like Iran and Russia into Chinese ports. The West treated this as a minor irritant, a workaround, a bit of sanctions evasion that was annoying but not strategically significant. What they missed was the scale. China wasn't running a workaround. It was running a parallel global energy logistics system, one that doesn't depend on Western financial infrastructure, Western insurance markets, or Western shipping lanes to function. When the strait closed and orthodox supply chains fractured, that parallel system kept moving. You heard that right. While conventional oil logistics seized up, China's alternative supply network absorbed the shock and kept delivering. And here's the payoff that lands hardest. None of this was accidental. None of it was lucky. Every cavern carved, every pipeline laid, every tanker added to that fleet was a deliberate decision, made by a government that looked at global energy geography and concluded that dependence was a vulnerability it could not afford. The West looked at the same geography and concluded that the global trading system would always keep things stable. One of those conclusions just got stress tested in real time. The nation's now scrambling to secure emergency energy supplies, paying crisis premiums, rationing industrial output, and watching their currencies weaken. They had the same information China had. They made different choices. And those choices are now the difference between resilience and collapse. China didn't get lucky when the strait closed. It got paid back for 20 years of preparation that nobody respected until the moment it mattered most. And when the rest of the world watched China absorb this shock without breaking, something shifted that no pipeline or cavern could ever build alone. Resilience as geopolitical currency. There's a moment in every crisis where the watching matters as much as the suffering, where nations that aren't directly in the fire are scanning the room, calculating who's standing and who's stumbling, and quietly updating every assumption they held about who the reliable partner is. That moment is happening right now, and what those nations are seeing is rewriting the diplomatic map in real time. You have to understand what it means for a country to watch this crisis unfold from the outside. You're a mid-sized nation. You're not a G7 member. You're not in NATO. You don't have the luxury of ideological allegiance. You have the obligation of survival. And what you've watched over the past several months is this. The United States and Europe, the powers that spent decades telling you their system was the only stable one worth joining, are rationing industrial output, burning through reserves, watching inflation surge, and still have no clear answer for when normal returns. Meanwhile, China kept its factories running. China kept its currency stable. China kept its energy flowing. China kept making offers. But this was just the beginning of what that visible stability was actually purchasing. Diplomatic loyalty in the modern world isn't bought with speeches or summits. It's earned through demonstrated capability under pressure. And the pressure of this crisis has run the most brutal capability test in a generation. The results are not ambiguous. Dozens of nations that were considered firmly in the Western diplomatic orbit, not adversaries, not aligned with Beijing, just broadly cooperative with Washington, are now hedging in ways they weren't 18 months ago, abstaining on votes they used to support automatically, opening infrastructure negotiations they used to decline out of deference, accepting yuan-denominated trade arrangements that quietly reduce their dollar dependency. None of it is loud. None of it makes headlines in the Western press. But it is compounding every single day the crisis continues. Then came the realization that cuts deepest of all. China didn't have to do anything aggressive to make this happen. It didn't invade anyone. It didn't issue threats. It didn't weaponize its position. It simply prepared, absorbed, and remained standing while others fell. And in a world where nations are making generational decisions about who to align with, who to build infrastructure with, who to trust when the next crisis comes, that demonstration of resilience is worth more than any military alliance or foreign aid package the West can assemble. You heard that right. China's greatest geopolitical victory in this crisis came not from aggression, but from the simple, devastating act of not needing to panic. And here's what makes this permanent, in a way that previous geopolitical shifts weren't. Every nation that signed a Chinese energy deal during this crisis signed it under duress, which means they signed it with full emotional memory of who was there and who wasn't. Every factory that switched to Chinese supply chains during this crisis did it because survival demanded it, and survival-driven decisions don't get reversed when the emergency fades. Every diplomat who watched China stay stable while their own economy convulsed updated their mental model of global power in a way no think tank report or State Department briefing will ever undo. The Strait didn't create any of this. That's the part that should stop you cold. The EVs were already being built. The pipelines were already flowing. The reserves were already full. The shadow fleet was already moving. The infrastructure deals were already being offered. Every advantage China is now cashing in on existed before a single ship was turned away from the strait. The crisis didn't hand China a new set of cards. It simply forced everyone else to finally look at the hand China had been holding for years. And what they saw, what you now see, is that while the world was debating whether China's rise was real, China was quietly, methodically, and without apology building the infrastructure of a world that runs on its terms. The strait closing didn't make China dominant. It just made it impossible for anyone to pretend otherwise.